Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Sharp, and I'm the director of the Ohio State University School of Environment and Natural Resources. Welcome to a new year and a new semester here at Ohio State. On behalf of our school, I want to acknowledge that Central Ohio is the traditional homeland of the Shawnee Nation, Miami, Wyandot, and other indigenous nations who have strong ties to these lands. Today, individuals from a broad range of indigenous backgrounds call Columbus and Central Ohio home. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respect to ancestors, elders, and relatives, relations past, present, and emerging. We will discuss this further in today's EPN virtual event, and thank you for joining us today. Classes started online at Ohio State University yesterday, and the students are virtually returning to campus in 2 weeks, or this week, and then they'll physically return to campus in a couple weeks. I know we have a number of folks who have signed up for this program and are still logging on now. When I last checked in with Nicole and Joel, there were about 260 individuals registered. Looks like we have about 219 folks here so far. We're delighted for such a great turnout. I think this is one of our best turnouts for our virtual EPNs, and it would be, if we were physically meeting, would be one of the biggest turnouts we've had for an event there as well. As you're joining us, please feel free to share with everyone in the chat box your name and where you are joining us from today. I appreciate that there are people actually joining us from around the country and around the globe today, so we'd love to hear where you're from. Adjust your message to send to all panelists and attendees. We're glad you're here. For those who are wondering, this program is being recorded and an edited version will be published on our EPN YouTube channel next week. The event is set up so that everyone will be kept on mute during the program and your cameras are not on. Before we start today's program, we do have an announcement to share related to EPN. At the end of this week, I'm sorry to say that Nicole Jackson is transitioning out of her role as EPN Program Coordinator and Assistant for the Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist Program. Nicole is an alumni of the school, graduated in the class of 2011 with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. She has worked for the school in some capacity for the past 7 years, including in support of the Youth Beat radio program. During this time, she's served on numerous boards, committees, and volunteered with local, regional, and national organizations. Many of you on this webinar today have worked directly with her in one way or another. We are grateful for her numerous contributions to our school and EPM. We're sad to see that she is leaving the school, though very excited to see where she goes next. We plan to continue our collaboration with Nicole through several avenues in 2021, so we're hopeful that she'll continue to have an impact on our community as she's had over the last couple of years. I ask that you take a look at the screen now to see some of the photos of events, activities, and programs that Nicole had a direct impact on creating, facilitating, and supporting, and that have stood out to our team over the past 2 years. I would say some of the most memorable events that we've had over the last couple of years are ones that Nicole was very actively involved in organizing. Thank you, Nicole, for helping us learn for life and shape our world. In the spirit and mission of the EPN, you have helped connect our community of environmental professionals, bridged divides, informed, and inspired us. I don't believe he has shared with you yet, Nicole, but Joe has sent a printed and framed copy of this certificate, as well as a compilation of these photos to you in the mail, and you should receive them this week. On the screen, you will see quotes from various partners of the EPN reflecting on their time and experience working with Nicole. Please take a second to read some of their reflections on the screen. As I look at the chat box, Nicole, it looks like there's many people that also have great wishes to pass along to you. Thank you, Nicole, for everything you've done. You've been a great inspiration for our community. Nicole, is there anything you'd like to share to our program attendees today?
Okay, just stop. Just stop. Just stop. I can't even. You're gonna make me emotional. Thank you so much, Joe, especially for gathering all of that. Thanks for the certificate. Thanks for being a wonderful supervisor and leading me through all of this crazy transitions within the past couple years. And I appreciate your guidance and helping develop my skills and connect more with EPN and in Ohio in general. I feel like I've had so many opportunities to engage with students, faculty, alums. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm like at a loss for words because just reading those messages. I appreciate all of you who are in the chat and who took their time to give those remarks. I'm kind of just, yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. This time has been awesome working with Ann, OCBM program, but that doesn't mean I won't be gone completely. I won't be far away. So don't think that this is the end. This is just the beginning. I will always be connecting, finding a way to reach out and connect through the university and within Ohio. Definitely not moving. I'll still be in Ohio as well. So if anybody wants to connect, reach out, please stay tuned. There's definitely more to come from me, and hopefully I can check in with some of you soon virtually. I know it's been a rough past year, but I'm looking forward to 2021 and what's to come. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Nicole. And I have to give a lot of credit to Nicole for helping us make the transition to our virtual environment. So programs like this are really, we've been able to do, I think, a pretty professional job of transitioning the EPN online, and it's really through the hard work of Nicole and sort of like her efforts to sort of figure this out for us. So thank you for everything you've done, both in so many different ways. So best wishes, and we'll hear from her again. And you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we'll see her profiled as one of our speakers in the future. So we look forward to working with you further. I see over 260 folks on the in the program, so this probably is a record for our virtual program. So thank you everybody for participating. Next week, the EPN will send out an introduction and welcome video featuring Cecil Okata, the new EPN program assistant. He joined the team last week and is well on his way to learning the ropes. Cecil is a 2017 graduate of the school and recently received his Master's of Environmental Science from Miami University with focus on sustainability in management and planning. Welcome aboard, Cecil. Now, moving into today's program, Nicole is going to run a poll here in Zoom. You should see two questions pop up on your screen asking you some questions that will inform elements of our program today. Once you complete question 1, then you will see question 2. Please take a second to respond to these optional questions. Our presenters will report the results back to everyone in a few minutes. Throughout my remarks, I will be sharing some words in Ojibwe Mowen. I can say Ojibwe well, Ojibwe Mowen, which is the language of the Ojibwe people. I will do my best to pronounce these words, though I know I will make some mistakes. I personally have been anticipating this program for some time. When we floated this idea, it's interesting how EPN ideas come together. We're just sort of brainstorming. Sometimes people will suggest things to us and we'll bounce things back and forth. And Joe really ran with this idea. Which we started talking about maybe a year or so ago. So I'm so delighted. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. My second question just popped up here on the screen, so I'm submitting that. We hosted an EPN program in September 2019 featuring the work and vision of Michael Charles, citizen of the Navajo Nation and an Ohio State University PhD candidate in chemical engineering. Hopefully some of you had a chance to participate in that program with us. I believe Michael is on the webinar today, and thank you for your presentation then. It helped me recognize the ecological stewardship of Indigenous communities around the world and the legacy of traditional knowledge in benefiting our planet. I learned more about the International Indigenous Peoples Forum's impact on climate change negotiations at the United Nations and Michael's leadership and direct involvement in it. He also gave us examples of meaningful collaborations between Indigenous peoples and knowledge and the scientific work within the academic community. We learned about the historical and concurrent exploitation of Western culture in its legacy of taking land and polluting our planet. Highlighting the voices and cultures of Indigenous peoples is one small step to beginning to make humanity more knowledgeable and better equipped to make decisions to improve our environment. Today is a new step to advance our knowledge of climate change adaptation with Indigenous and tribal communities and leaders. This year, I've begun to work with our development team and staff and faculty within our school to focus attention and improve our use of the Morin American Indian Scholarship Fund within our school. This was a fund that was set up many years ago through a direct contribution that still exists, and we're hoping to sort of expand and encourage people to make contributions to the school in the name of this fund that we will allow us to continue to make further investments in our American Indian community. This annual scholarship supports Native American students in natural resources, environmental protection, or wildlife management. However, I know that we can do more to enhance visibility, eligibility, and greater impact of this and other scholarship opportunities to Native students. If you're a current student in our school and are a member of a federally recognized tribe, or if you're affiliated with the American Indian movement, then please feel free to contact Joe Campbell directly, who can link you to the appropriate staff in our academic team for these resources. We'll also be sending out some fundraising calls to folks that might want to invest in this scholarship fund so that we can have a robust amount of resources to pass along to students in the form of scholarships. I also want to note that our school is currently hiring an early career faculty position in forest ecology and restoration, who will develop a research and teaching program with an emphasis on the ecology and restoration of forest ecosystems. We are interested in candidates whose research addresses forest management and restoration issues affecting and prioritized by women, Indigenous people, and marginalized minorities, which could include research on traditional ecological knowledge or ethnobotany in forest restoration. Using forest restoration to enhance the economic and social well-being of underprivileged communities, and the role of Indigenous people in structuring reference conditions for forest restoration. The job application deadline is January 15th, and if you are interested in learning more, please contact Joe. While there are no federally recognized tribes with land in Ohio, there are over a dozen tribes in neighboring states, including Michigan and Indiana. Members of our school are meeting this week with the Department of Natural Resources for the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, who actively steward lands in now Indiana and Michigan. We recognize that fundamental shifts are needed in academia, and I understand as director of this school that often we fail to go beyond conditional inclusion to fundamentally shift relationships between settlers and Indigenous peoples. It will take time for us to build positive, mutually beneficial relationships through their examples, although there are examples going forward. Michael's work with the United Nations, as well as the program we are featuring today, a Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu, Dibaginjigaadeg Anishinaabe Ezhitwaad, which translates to doing something based on the Anishinaabe way. On the screen, you will see the agenda for today. 5 of our speakers, each authors and contributors to the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu, will be speaking together next and taking questions simultaneously. At around 11:10, Dr. John Lowe, Newark Earthworks of the Newark Earthworks Center at The Ohio State University at Newark, will be speaking. I want to thank Ziigwanikwe Katy for working with Joe to help me learn and practice the Ojibwe Moan language and words that help to inform today's program. I also want to thank Rob Croll from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission for working with Nicole and the EPN team to create a resource guide regarding Ojibwe treaty rights and additional tribal climate change adaptation resources. A document containing these resources will be shared at the end of the program in a follow-up email to you tomorrow. Bios for Katy and Rob are on the screen. We also will have brief professional bios for Gidigaa, bizhiw, Jerry, and Sara on the screen. A brief speaker bio for Kristen Schmitt is listed on the screen. Last, John Lowe's bio is here, who again will be joining us at 11:10. Extended speaker bios are featured at our program page located at epn.osu.edu. Please notice that in the chat box, Nicole has posted some basic directions if you have general comments. Post those in the chat box, as well as to troubleshoot technological or connection issues directly with our event hosts, Joe and Nicole, in case you have them. We encourage you to ask questions directly to our panelists during this program using the Q&A function that is located in the Zoom taskbar at the bottom of your screen. If you have specific questions for a speaker, then please type in the @ symbol followed by the speaker's first name. We invite your comments and questions and have built in time at the end of the program for questions to be answered throughout. Please make sure you click the Q&A icon to activate that feature and to see any questions that our panelists may have answered. Thank you. And I'm so honored to welcome Ziigwanikwe, Kate, Rob, and Gidigaa, Bizhiw, Jerry, Sara, and Kristen.
Segu swawegu, Sara Smith Yungiats, Oniotiaga Ni'i Okale Wagwaho Nuagadalona. So hello everyone, my name is Sara Smith and I am from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. I work as the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the Ecological and Menominee Nation and the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So we are here today to talk about our Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu, and we will get that started right now. So the Tribal Adaptation Menu was created by a team of authors. All the authors are listed here in this graphic, along with a lot of the institutions that were part of it at the bottom. And so this team is made up of a lot of unique partners from across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, including tribal members, college institutions, intertribal agencies, and also federal institutions like Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. So it was a very unique team that came together and created this menu. And this photo was taken back in the fall of 2019 when we received an award for the Tribal Adaptation Menu. Some of these folks are on our call today. And this is just a snapshot of our author team. Looking at the graphic from the previous slide, there are a lot more that weren't here. And we also, have young folks in our group as well. Jondreau is in the photo here. And we also have a few other young members of our team as well. So it's a very diverse group that we have. And so we're going to do introductions right now. I know everyone did introductions in the chat, so we'll be doing this for our authors. And so I already introduced myself. So if maybe Rob, you want to start, and we'll just go around.
Bizhiw Nishi Bimarazi, Rob Indigenous, Going in the Demasim, Philadelphia and Dunjaba, Anishinaabe Aki Enda, Glifwick and Denoki. My name's Rob Croll. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. For those who don't know who we are really quickly, we're an intertribal natural resources agency. We work with our 11 Ojibwe member tribes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to help them implement their treaty rights for off-reservation hunting, fishing, and gathering, and to protect the natural resources upon which they depend. Miigwech.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Kristen Schmitt, and I work with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I'm based out of Duluth, Minnesota. The focus of our organization is really on helping folks that work in natural resources or work on the landscape think about how to make decisions that incorporate climate change.
Bizhiw, Gakina, Gidigaa, Bizhiw, Indigenous, Zaji, Jacques, and Dudem. We Kwe-dunk and Dojuban, Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, Anini and Dow. So thank you for the introductions there, Jeff and Joe and Nicole and everyone that's been helping us get this going and for asking us to share with you today. My name is Jerry Jondreau. I am the owner and operator with my partner here at Dynamite Hill Farms. We've been working on the Tribal Adaptation Menu for a while. My background is in forestry and natural resources, and we currently reside on my reservation, which is the Keweenaw Indian community in the western Upper Peninsula of Michigan on Lake Superior.
Bonjour, Gakinawia, Ziigwanikwe, Indigenous, Mang and all day, Miss Pokagon and Dunjaba, Makunsaban and Baba, Ban Shnabe, when the Kazoban. Omain dananokian ma mishka meoking kote ma wishkun singin tunjiba nojago nimba nandawaban nandagakin dame no manishna beoking miigwe chapjiga pijayik the business to make no. So my name is Katy Bresette. I'm known as Ziigwanikwe. Spring is my name's translation. I'm of the Loon clan member from the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe over in Wisconsin on Lake Superior. Like Jerry said, we are living and raising our families here in Michigan. Myself, I have a background in Ojibwe language and culture education, and so I've been an educator for a long time, and I'm just really grateful. I wanted to just tell everyone thank you, Miigwe Chapje. Thank you so much for coming and listening today, and hopefully we have some things you're wanting to hear. So Miao Minik Nungom will be speaking a little bit later.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And so it looked like we had a lot of attendees today. I think it says about 275. A lot of those are students and academics, so welcome. Like Katie said, I hope you learned something today and are really interested in what we're talking about. So we're going to start by talking about adaptation menus in general and how they work. So I'll hand this over to Kristen.
Wonderful. Thanks again for the introductions, and thanks for managing the slides there, Sarah. So we thought it'd be great to start today just with a little bit of background information on what is an adaptation menu, specifically a climate change adaptation menu. And so fundamentally, the adaptation menus are really just a tool to help people make decisions about what they want to do on the landscape for a particular ecosystem. And I think the adaptation menus and the idea behind them are really rooted in this kind of central concept about adaptation. There's no one proper way or one correct way to respond to climate change. The decisions that people make for a particular landscape are going to depend on a lot of different things. For example, you know, where they are on the landscape, what their particular values are for that landscape, what kind of goals they're working towards on that land. And so all of these things are really going to inform decisions that people make about climate change adaptation. So there are about a dozen different climate change adaptation menus at this point, and my co-panelists today will talk a lot about how the tribal adaptation menu itself is unique and different, and the need for that tribal adaptation menu, but there are a couple of common characteristics with all of these climate change adaptation menus that we thought were important to mention. So first of all, I remember there being a picture on the right, but I must have put that in an animation. Thanks, Sarah. First of all, the menu format is really exactly what it sounds like. You know, you wouldn't walk into a restaurant and order every single thing on the menu. And a climate change adaptation menu is really no different. It's not a checklist of things that you should do in response to climate adaptation. It's really a list of options that you can pick and choose from based on what works for the landscape that you're in or the landscape that you're helping to care for. So again, you're really meant to pick and choose ideas from a variety of options presented. And then we think another advantage to just the format of a menu is how it's organized. If you look at the tribal adaptation menu, it's organized into these broad ideas or strategies, kind of at the very largest level. And that kind of moves to more specific approaches. And then within each approach, there are a couple of suggestions for more specific actions, which we call tactics. And so this really helps to connect the dots, if you were, between broad climate change adaptation ideas and really specific on the ground actions. And this is something that we've heard from a lot of folks is a little bit difficult working with climate change adaptation. How do you kind of frame what you're doing on the landscape in terms of these broad adaptation ideas? And then finally, as you see here, the menus are meant to be a bit of a brainstorming tool. So, you know, we all kind of get stuck in our ways of doing things on the landscape, and the menus are really meant to kind of broaden that perspective in some ways and maybe give you ideas on how to cope with climate change that you hadn't thought about before, that you haven't done before. And so there's a significant aspect to helping boost creativity and creative thinking in terms of climate adaptation that goes along with this. And so finally, I'll just mention that menus can be a valuable tool to kind of look through and fuel brainstorming by themselves, but really the way we use them often is as part of a broader decision-making process. So we use them as a tool to help identify adaptation actions after, you know, taking the time to think about where you are on the landscape and what your goals are for that landscape. What are some of the climate risks associated with that? So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but they're often used in conjunction with this broader decision-making process. And so I'll turn it over now to Jerry to talk a little bit more specifically about the tribal adaptation menu itself and why that is necessary and how that effort got started.
Yeah, miigwech, Kristen. I think, Sarah, did you want to kind of kick it off there with maybe recalling the Menominee project?
Yeah, I can do that. So the idea for the tribal adaptation menu really began back in early 2017. So some folks pictured here, well, the folks pictured here were part of one of NIAC's workshops on forested watersheds. And so like the workshops we do, a lot of people will bring a project to work on. And the project that they were working on was with Menominee, or wild rice. And while they were going through the process, they noticed and realized that, you know, this menu was really great for doing this kind of work, but there was really this need for Indigenous perspectives to do adaptation planning, especially with Menominee, which is a really culturally significant being to Ojibwe. And so this is where the idea for a tribal specific adaptation menu was created. And so, Jerry, did you want to share your story?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in here. So as I mentioned in my introduction, you know, I've got a background in forestry, and really I got my start in natural resources, working for my tribe's natural resources department as a technician. And so our reservation is actually, it spans both sides of Keweenaw Bay here in the Western UP. The Lake Superior is a big part of who we are, and fishing is a big part of our history and also contemporary. We have we still have our fishermen that are out there, but we're also the largest forested reservation in the state of Michigan. And so when I got my start in natural resources, you know, it was with my tribe and with sort of that cultural lens when we were looking at the problems, which was a really good foundation for me. But my tribe had never had an actual forester before. We've always had, since the Indian Reorganization Act, we've had a BIA forester that has essentially made all the decisions for management, forest management on our reservation. And we've never actually had one of our tribal members be in a position to help with that management. So I was encouraged to go back to school. I went to school up at Michigan Tech, and I got my degree in forestry there, and came back and started the first tribal natural or forestry department. And as I think about it, I can't even think of any other you know, tribes anywhere close to us that even have their own you know, forestry department, you know, outside of like the BIA itself. So it was kind of a big deal. And once I got in there, I really wanted to change what forestry was. And so it's not just about boards and cords necessarily, but it's also taken into consideration cultural uses and different, different perspectives about what the forest is. It's our relatives, it's our foods, it's our place for ceremony. It has a lot more meaning to us from a cultural perspective, and that wasn't really represented in typical forest management. And what I found as a forester was it was very difficult to find any resources really out there that that tell you, how to do forestry in Ojibwe country. It just doesn't exist. There's nothing that's out there. And so I had a really hard time, and I struggled often trying to justify my actions to agencies like the BIA that still have this paternalistic, perceived paternalistic relationship with the tribes, and using culture as the rationale, and that just wasn't really jiving with them. So I was floundering quite a bit because there's just nothing really out there, and it was a very westernized perspective of what forestry is. And if there wasn't some sort of a peer-reviewed journal article that was out there that actually justifies what I was talking about, then it wasn't actually real, which made me very frustrated. And so when I actually heard about this, when I'd actually gone with Kristen before in the past, and I had attended a workshop, a climate adaptation workshop with NIAX, looking at sugar maple in our area. And so I was familiar with the process, but then I had heard that there was this group that was looking to sort of analyze, how can we, look at this process, and how can we make this better suited, this adaptation process better suited for cultural perspectives. And I got really excited because I haven't really had the option to work with many people that were thinking similarly. And so they had invited me to participate early on, and I was really thankful for that. There's just so many different, things to look at when you're using that cultural lens, and you're also talking about, land management, and it's a really difficult process to try to work through. And so we convened this group of people early on to start talking about this. And it ended up being about a 2-year process, and it's ongoing too, because it's considered a living document. But to be able to, speak about these things comfortably was really important. Oftentimes, as a tribal member, in a room full of natural resources professionals, I'm one voice really that's talking about these things, and it can often get discredited, or it doesn't hold the weight that it should. And so being in a room and with a group of people that understood what was going on was actually really helpful. And we took the time to actually learn each other, to work on this together. But it became apparent early on that there were a lot of things that we had to address. There was, just the way that we spoke about natural resources. It became apparent that the English language wasn't well equipped to do that. And I think Katie is probably going to go into that a little bit later about the language component, but it's very important. The Ojibwe language has essentially, it's of this place. That language is of this place. We have names and relationships with everything that's up here already, and so there's concepts built into that the English language can't even cover. The English language doesn't even have those concepts in there. So it was a really interesting process, and the outcome really, I think, is really important, because for other tribal people that are doing, or even non-tribal people that are trying to look at different approaches to climate change and climate adaptation, we actually have something now that's published that actually gives you the license to do things differently, and not just to follow along with the academic script, but to also introduce different layers of being. As human beings, we're not just a brain that's being carried around by two legs, but we have emotions, we have feelings, we have sensations that all make us human. And when we talk about science and especially like natural resources management and stuff like that, it's very, very dry, and it's very linear, and it's devoid of all those emotions. And in a way, it's not actually a human approach as far as I'm concerned. It's a robotic approach. And so with this tribal adaptation menu, we were allowed to sort of to have more of a holistic perspective when we're looking at these things, and also to really get people involved. I think one of the biggest things that have happened since colonization, especially for our folks, is the severed relationships that we have between the land as Ojibwe people, the severed relationships between our own selves, between our families, the familial structures. There's been a lot of relationships that have been broken up by colonization, and really, to undo colonization, we have to start rekindling those relationships. And through this TAM menu, we try to address that as well. So there's, if you guys ever get a chance to check out the menu, definitely do that. But some of the first strategies that we're talking about in there is really like talking to your community. It doesn't say go research the JSTOR, and pick up the first peer-reviewed journal article. It says talk to your people first. Get the community together, bring everyone together, get those elders together, have them share their stories first. And so some of those the way that we tried to set it up was really looking at relationships first and foremost. And we could really talk about that for any of these things for days on end, but the language was really important. Wordsmithing, the inherent hierarchy, for those of you that are interested in linguistics and stuff like that, the inherent hierarchy that's built into the English language is inescapable. And from our perspective, when we look at Mother Nature and everything else that's around us, these other beings that we share this place with, we're all supposed to be on equal levels. And when you start using the English language to talk about those things, you inherently introduce hierarchy, where humans are the most important thing on that discussion. And from our perspective, really, and if you look at the old stories, we're actually beneath everything else because we're the last beings to be here, and we rely on everything else around us and sharing their gifts for us to actually live a minabuma ziwin, or that good life. And so really we're below everything if you kind of think about it from those old stories, and we're not above anything. So yeah, there's a lot to cover, but I'll take a break for a second.
Yeah, that's great, Jerry. And you pretty much covered everything in this slide, so that's why I advanced it forward. And so yeah, this is really meant to be adaptable for other tribes as well. So this version is based primarily on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives and language and culture, but it can be used in other communities as well. And you can incorporate, if you're Navajo, you can incorporate your values and your language in there as well. And it's meant to be, used across diverse ecosystems too. So ours, is mainly based in the Midwest, the northern region. So we don't specifically talk about things like sea level rise or drought in the desert or things like that, but it is really adaptable to be used in those scenarios, and they have been in our workshops. And so like Jerry said, it's helping to bridge those communication barriers for non-tribal persons or organizations that are interested in working with Indigenous people on climate adaptation, and really understanding how to do that in a really respectful way. And I will turn it to Katie.
So Jerry did a really wonderful introduction about Jerry and Sarah did great just bringing in that idea of, why is it that this conversation began in the first place? That lack, there's this missing voices. And a lot of what folks tend to miss in that conversation is whose voices we're speaking of, because we as humans typically only hear each other's voices. We only really recognize and understand each other from that perspective, especially nowadays. A lot of times these other voices that may not be recognizable to us just through our ears and through what we're seeing and how we're experiencing, get lost in the mix. And so I was brought in earlier, not quite as early as everyone else, but when those issues, when the idea of what language should be used and how do we bring these concepts forward? How do you describe this in the limited languages that we have in our verbal access or our oral access to these understandings? How do you bring that forward, especially in a document that has to be written? Where we come from as Anishinaabe, as Ojibwe people, we work we are taught about the importance of speaking. And as I've been taught that conversation, the reason why you continue to use your words, and it's important to have longer conversations, to use take the time to spend time with each other, is because those words are alive. Who we are, and as we exist, you'll hear a story over and over again, and each time you hear that story, it might be a bit different. It might have changed a little bit more, but in saying that story and speaking those words, you breathe that life into those understandings, and you create a moment in which not only do you bring forward all of the things that have come behind you, but you also are able to walk that idea and walk those concepts forward to the ones who aren't quite yet here. And so it's a struggle to put those ideas, that life, onto something that exists online or in a piece of paper. And we wanted to be very intentional in that work. And so when I was brought in because of the fact that I've had a lot of training and had a lot of time, and my mind just tends to work a little bit differently than other people. And so as we did that work, as we were coming forward, beautiful things, like Jerry had said, an idea such as the terminology, like why would we call things, right? We talk about beings in our space, where a tree is a being, that rice is a being, and they have agency. Jerry usually will remind people, these beings have agency. They have ways of inherent rights and ways of existing in this place that as people we tend to exert our existences on top of them. And so what you're seeing on this slide is an idea of values, right? One of these are some typical, they're called the 7 grandfather teachings. You'll see them, you can find them online. They're one of a foundational teaching, or a powerful teaching that a lot of people use because it's a concept that you can easily bring across, that speaks of thinking of things firstly from these positions. If you took these values and you looked at what you were going to do, any step you were going to make, any decision that was sitting on your plate, and you first understood them from a value-based understanding, you would use things such as your wisdom, your care, your love, respect, this bravery. And bravery, that word is a beautiful word, especially in Ojibwe, when it means zungede'e. That zungede'e, zunge is the word for strength, but we're not talking like muscle strength, where it's different than that, but it's strength of heart. De'e, your de is your heart within it. And so to speak of bravery is to speak of strength of heart. In that honesty, like doing things in that right way, your humility and your truth, and understanding. As Ojibwe people, we come from a place where we understand my truth doesn't necessarily negate another human's truth, another person's truth, or another being's truth at that. And it's very important to take into consideration what happens when you believe that your truth exceeds or exerts itself over other people's truths as well. And so taking our time to really look at those values from that point of view, we began the menu itself with what we called the guiding principles. And we use that term very intentionally. We understood that we intended this to be a living document, something that could be taken in from my community, perhaps in Red Cliff, or Jerry's community here in the Keweenaw, or applied down in the Menominee Nation, or perhaps out in some of those southern communities, right, over with the Dene folks out west, right? Some of our salmon brothers and sisters. How could we take something that brought forward this idea that guided individuals, but spoke to the truth of a place, spoke to the stories and the language of a space. And the most beautiful thing about working in Indigenous communities is that as American people and as American societies, we as Anishinaabe or Indigenous folks here on this land, we still speak the language of this land. We still know the songs. We still are able to tell the stories of language and words and feelings and understandings that go on for millennia, and they're still here. They exist right here today, and it's not something you have to go to a museum and try and interpret. It's not something you have to necessarily try and go read from somewhere. There are people who still can talk to that here, and what we're looking at in a time and place such as, you know, something as serious as climate change is this understanding that we don't understand. We as a people don't understand this earth any longer. We don't understand what's happening in this place. But Anishinaabe people, Indigenous people, they have these understandings. They exist still to this day. I would argue across the globe, you know, that idea of being Indigenous or indigeneity comes from that space. And so these guiding principles were really designed to be at the forefront. So if you look at the menu itself, the first 5 pages are written on how to reframe for yourself when, unfortunately, most of us have all been brought up in you know, very mainstream education, very siloed understanding, and our brains have been taught. Our minds have been taught to think a very, very, very specific way, like Jerry was sharing with us, that very linear perspective, separate things out into their separate spaces.
Boxes,
Yep, bring things out to their boxes. And so the guiding principles was a way to, for us to help others who may not have had some of this experience, who may not have access to some of these teachings, who might not have been brought up in this way, to start to reframe for themselves. What happens if I look at this from a different point of view? How could I perhaps step back from a role that perhaps I feel as I must lead, or I have to say something because I'm the professional, because I have, you know, the piece of paper that says I'm in charge? What happens if I step back from that and start to listen? And so by using these guiding principles as our foundation, we were able to begin to show, this is something that we spend a good amount of time on when we're doing workshops and training folks on how to use the menu to facilitate that idea of engagement. And it says on the slide here, community engagement, but when you really understand what community engagement means, do you know that when I say engage with my community, I'm also speaking about the water? Jerry was talking very, very seriously about how our communities were Lake Superior and Anishinaabe, and so the lake itself, that is a part of our community. That space is, and the Manidug, what we call it's translated as spirits, but I struggle with that translation sometimes. But the entities, the beings who maybe perhaps we as humans don't quite know how to directly relate to, those beings in those spaces are a part of this community. They're a part of these stories. They're a part of this understanding. I challenge anyone to spend any time on these Great Lakes and tell me that lake doesn't have a life of itself. I mean, there's a reason why even your peoples have stories of the lake and its life-taking abilities. And how powerful it might be out there.
Life-giving abilities too.
Yeah,
there's always the balance. And I think another thing to maybe highlight in this spot too is the guiding principles. We understood that, you know, in the natural resources profession, there's very few Native people. There's very few African Americans. There's not a whole lot of diversity that's out there. You know, hopefully that's changing. but it's going to take a while for that to really, have some equitable representation. So the guiding principles is there to actually help like non-tribal folks work with tribal people in a good way. And so there's some instructions in there because we're kind of sick of being taken advantage of, to put it bluntly. And so there are some instructions in there for the non-tribal communities to try and get a better understanding of how to work with our folks again, and how to in a good way, and not just be takers where you come in and you take some traditional knowledge and you put it in your paper and then you're gone. So establishing real relationships is something again that's really important and sort of foundational in this in that portion of the menu.
And that's something that you'll find throughout the menu itself. And it's something that we're very intentional and very purposeful. We as a group very intentionally make sure there are tribal members represented during our training processes, so that we can bring these conversations forward for anyone who'd be interested in working on this. What does it look like? What does it look like when you truly begin to work within a community and walk in with the humility, right? One of those values and characteristics that's well understood in our spaces, with the humility of understanding, perhaps I don't know, perhaps I'm the one who needs to learn amongst this. And so that's been a huge part of what we've used this menu to bring forward the legitimacy and to create on a document, what does it mean to acknowledge that? And it's not, a lot of folks are using that idea of traditional ecological knowledge. Where we come from, it's just knowledge. It doesn't have to be characterized in such a way. It doesn't have to be put into this little box, because it's an understanding and it's foundational, it's fundamental. And
it's true.
And it's true, right? It has this layer of truth that Jerry really brings this up a lot whenever we're visiting or talking with folks. There's one point in time when all of humanity was sustainable. It's not a piece of knowledge that all of a sudden we have to find or discover or has to be created. It existed across the globe here. And so part of that is really acknowledging, what does it mean to see ourselves, like Jerry has said, in relation to these spaces again, and understand the balance in which we really need to participate in. And that's what I think a lot of those guiding principles and those underlying layers of what this adaptation menu can be used for brings that forward, and understanding, what does it mean to find yourself in relation to space again, and how do we do that in an environment where we're restricted, right? We're restricted by the fact that we have to have our jobs. We're stuck in this economy, right? We have to be working within these spaces. So how do we use our privileges, our backgrounds, our experiences, our seats at these tables to make these conversations, bring these conversations forward, and help create an environment in which they're possible in a way perhaps other people only dreamed of, a couple of decades ago. So I think that's probably about what I have for the moment. Sarah, I don't remember who I'm tag teaming after that one, you guys. Maybe was it Rob?
So I guess it's me next.
Yeah, Popcorn Rob.
So we want to talk just a little bit really quickly, because I know we're flying through and running out of our time, but our strategies and our approaches and how they're kind of a little bit different, and they differ because of that perspective and that cultural lens between management documents from traditional Western perspectives versus Indigenous perspectives. So on the left, you see one strategy from the forest adaptation menu, which very straightforward Western management style, facilitate community adjustments through species transitions, assisted migration, introducing species that are going to be expected to be adapted or adaptable to future conditions on the land in which you're working. From the tribal adaptation menu, different, because it's recognizing that relationship potential with those new beings and encouraging community adjustments and transitions while maintaining that reciprocity and balance, seeking out and sharing traditional and cultural knowledge of these new beings that may be coming to your area or you may be introducing to your area, but going to the communities, the tribal communities where those beings are natives and seeking out that knowledge so that you can have that deeper, more functional relationship and not just treat them as resources. These are the first 3 strategies in the menu. As Jerry pointed out, very intentional, bringing in community members and elders, considering that reciprocity that's talked about in the guiding principle section, supporting tribal engagement and making that a priority as part of climate adaptation. And then strategy number 2, which we can talk about for hours because it took literal hours to create, but recognizing that when you're a natural resource manager, you want to manage and you want to do things and you want to get in there and fix it. And maybe you need to take that step back and watch and let the land and the Manadug and all of those beings that you have that relationship teach you about themselves and what needs to happen there. So as we've talked about, this process, this menu started at a workshop. We continue to do workshops using the menu to teach people how to use it, to help people do adaptation planning for their communities. Workshops have kind of been on hiatus now for a year because we found out that they don't translate well to the virtual space. We need to have people in the room interacting together and creating relationships and creating new ways of thinking. But we take the menu, we have teams come to our workshops, bring projects in that we then go step by step through the menu process with them through the guiding principles and hopefully help them create a culturally appropriate adaptation plan for themselves, for their communities. And so this is just a little case study. We actually had our first fully completed project that was planned at a tribal adaptation menu workshop. It was actually the Iowa tribe of Oklahoma. One of their folks came to our first workshop that we did before the tribal adaptation menu was even published. So the process that Kristen described a little bit, first defining management objectives and goals, just looking at a small wetland area that had ceased to function and restoring that area and how to go about doing that in a good way. Looked at climate challenges for the area there, serious seasonal precipitation changes, very dry conditions oftentimes, and then it's Oklahoma, so extreme heat and or rainfall. And then working it through the menu. So kind of a very direct and Western sort of approach, maintaining and enhancing community and structural diversity, but doing that using native beings and thinking about the goals and the relationships that you want to have there in that place by planting a variety of native pollinator-friendly wetland plants, some of which I believe were also medicinal or subsistence-based. And then because this is a community space, consulting with cultural practices, seeking spiritual guidance, working with cultural leaders and community members and elders to get input on a long-term management plan for the site, and consulting with the elders on appropriate languages for interpretive materials there. Yeah, a little different from your traditional Western perspective, with some of the same outcomes, but also some very different ones.
Yeah, so that actually concludes our presentation portion. And so what's next in our team planning? So we do plan to have more in-person workshops. Like Rob said, we did try to have a small mini one virtually, but it really didn't work for this kind of workshop that we're doing. And so we're waiting until things are good to resume our in-person workshops. We've had a lot of great feedback and asks from different communities for these workshops. And so because of the high demand that we're getting, we are also working on a train the trainer type of course for those who have been in our workshops and worked with us a lot throughout, maybe multiple workshops, things like that. So we can actually have more facilitators to do these workshops. We're a relatively small group of people who have a lot of other things on our plate with our jobs and our life. So it's really good to have more facilitators with the amount of asks that we're giving. So this is just our contact information if you'd like to get a hold of us. And I'll stop it there, and we can open it up now for questions.
I don't know if all the panelists saw this, but there are a couple of questions that came in the Q&A pod that might make for some interesting discussion. So I was wondering if anything jumps out to folks as something they wanted to talk about for the next few minutes.
Yeah, there's a couple questions on here, and just so everyone knows too, like for sure Katie and I are going to be staying on here even after this has wrapped up, because these questions and these concepts and the answers themselves are sometimes very involved, and they take a lot of time. So we're planning on sticking around for a while after we're all done here too. So if there's questions on there that we didn't get to necessarily, like, we'll try to get to them at the very end. There's some good questions in here too. Miigwech, Michael Charles there for the shout out. I see there's one about I'm having a hard time grasping the concept of doing forestry with a different cultural lens and a tangible sense. Is it possible you could provide an example of how this type of forestry differs from standard forestry? The best way that I can try to answer that is it's not prescriptive. And it's really important that you understand and you establish a relationship with that stand before you even attempt to try and make some sort of management recommendations. As Ojibwe people, we've utilized the forest for everything from foods to medicines to structures, and you name it. We've had when we still do have a very intimate relationship with the forest. And so I think the most important thing is establishing that relationship with the forest itself, seeing that forest throughout the changing seasons, not just showing up in the summertime when you have your clipboard and you've got your basal area prism and you're taking data, and then you're out, and then you use that data, you put it into your Excel spreadsheet, and you come up with some sort of a prescription based on that. Like, I'm saying that, you should establish a relationship with that stand before you even start doing that, because what you're doing with the Western approach to forestry is very prescriptive. It's very linear. If your basal area is this amount, this, you should bring it down to this amount, or it's just very prescriptive. And every single one of those forests and those stands are going to be a little bit different, and maybe they have some pretty unique spring ephemerals that show up in the springtime, and when you showed up with your clipboard in the summer, they were already gone, and so you don't even understand all the beings that are out there. And so it's very important to have a relationship, and that means that we have to either number one, we have to have more like trained foresters to take the time to spend building those relationships with the woods. Or we need to empower the people again and allow the people to utilize those spaces, and then talk to the people and say, okay, what do you think that we could do here? But then also remember to respect the actual trees themselves. I've said this time and time again. And this is trying to help you answer that question. You know, throughout the history of the United States, you know, this country has always subjugated somebody. You know, and initially it was the indigenous people, it was Native Americans, and the subjugation and this manifest destiny and genocidal practices that were taking place, and some that are still in play right now. But eventually over time, you know, society's like, well, it's not cool to just slaughter a bunch of Native people. You know, so it changed. Like socially, it was unacceptable to just run in and kill a bunch of Native people, which is great. I'm thankful for that. But then also you start looking at the, you know, the African American community, or the Africans themselves. You know, they were brought over here and subjugated to slavery. You know, over time we've had civil rights movements, and it's no longer acceptable to actually own people, which is another huge hurdle, you know, for humanity in this country. You look at women as well. You know, women have always been subjugated as barefoot and pregnant, stay inside. You know, that's where a woman's place is. You know, you can't vote, you can't drive, you can't be an executive. You know, all these issues. You know, women were subjugated again through civil rights movements and women's suffrage and all this. You know, that we've societally we've moved along. But the one demographic that is yet to be liberated is nature. Nature is still subjugated by this country, by these people, by these practices. Nature does not have rights. And until nature gets those rights, you know, forestry is just going to continue to be this, well, I know what's best, so I'm going to do what I want approach. And so there's not really a direct way to answer that question, but there's a lot of things for you to think about, because they're going to differ from space to space. So number one is, you know, building that relationship with those forests before you determine any sort of management. Understand who's all there, who's all using that, you know, what animals are using it, what insects are using that space. Really what it requires is that we slow the hell down. Slow down. We don't have to go 100 miles an hour constantly. That's what's getting us into trouble. So definitely slow down. Take a moment to understand where you're at, who's there, you know, who are the other beings that are using that space, and then get the community involved as well. So hopefully that kind of answers your question there. And we might be running out of time here too.
So Joe just suggested that maybe I want to try and answer Michael Charles's question before we switch over. And that question is, can an adaptation menu like this scale to fit and inform different governing bodies? For example, can this work built-in language, localized knowledge, and community impact decisions or funding at state, federal, or global level? Yes, because these concepts, the concepts that are contained in this menu aren't just, they're universal, really. You know, my ancestors came to this country back in the 1600s from Germany and England. And there, many of these concepts were built in and were culturally removed by certain religions and things. So these concepts are universal. But also, if you think about the indigenous perspectives that we built into the menu, they can translate at larger scale, and they're being actively promoted at state level, heavily with the incoming Biden administration. GLFWC and the other treaty organizations are putting together now a guidance document for the Biden administration. And one of the two things that's heavily promoted in that guidance document is the Tribal Adaptation Menu. And if any of my fellow panelists would like to jump in and add to it, I can see Katie right there.
Go ahead.
No, I'm teasing. We're running out of time, but I want to keep moving on with it. There's other times and space. This is a long conversation, and I think Jerry's point of understanding and taking time to be in relation and speaking, it's important to have the conversation in the first place. So I think that's the whole point of this whole space, is to to show people that there's a type, we can start talking about these things again, and it's important. So I will be hush up now.
All right, thank you. Thank you all so much. Miigwech. We will now transition over to Dr. John Lau, who's director of the Newark Earthworks Center here in the state of Ohio at Ohio State. But although our panelists will be on until 11:30, and then as Jerry mentioned, he and Katie will stay on a little bit afterwards, even after our formal program concludes. So over to you, Dr. Lau.
Miigwech Joe, bizhiw, Jayak, hello everyone. Nichniga, how are you? John Lau Deshnikas, my name's John. Anishinaabe, human being. Pokagon, Potawatomi, Nini. St. Joseph River Valley, Pokagon Band, Potawatomi citizen. And Miske Dodem, Turtle Clan. And I had the good fortune of growing up in that Pokagon Potawatomi community. And we are in Southwest Michigan and Northwest Indiana. We're, oddly enough, the closest tribe, federally recognized tribe, to Ohio State where I teach, 400 miles away, which is an oddity when you think of Ohio as being one of the epicenters of indigenous populations before 1492 in 1600. But there's a great ethnic cleansing, a great clearing away, a great genocide of indigenous peoples out of this area. So there are no reservations in Pennsylvania, no reservations in West Virginia, no reservations in Ohio, no reservations in Kentucky, no reservations in Illinois. Well, why is that? Because of Indian removal, right? The sweeping away of us. And so I'm back here teaching, and I'm a director of Newark Earthworks Center, which is not an archaeology center. It is a center that celebrates the achievements of indigenous peoples, including building the earthworks, but also more contemporary achievements, past, present, and future. So really appreciated the panel today. Learned a lot. Has me thinking a lot. But some thoughts I wanted to share. We're working at the Earthworks Center with other parts of Ohio State University with outreach to the historic tribes, the citizens of the historic tribes that used to be here. And there's about 42 tribes that are connected to what is now called Ohio. And so we are we have commenced and are continuing outreach to those tribes. And some of those have been successful already. Eastern Band of Shawnee in Oklahoma, Wendat Nation of Oklahoma, Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, Forest County Band, Potawatomi, Wisconsin. So, but that outreach is a process, right? And as other people, I'm repeating what other people have already said, is that outreach is a process of building relationships, of building trust, building understanding. What Native people, what we as Native people don't need is anybody coming to us and telling us what they're going to do for us. Those days are over, hopefully. And so what we need to do is develop relationships where we ask and we listen. Those are probably the two biggest characteristics that I need to keep in my pocket that we need to do. So some of the challenges that we have, we are a land grant university, which essentially, as many of you know, means that we're a land grab university, that all the land grant universities, whatever how noble the idea was, the moral act of 1864 to take lands that the federal government had procured, sell those lands and take the monies to fund public higher education. Sounds like a great idea. Except the problem is that the lands that were taken and sold to create this endowments that funded universities like Ohio State, like the University of Minnesota, like Michigan State, and many others, that land was taken from Indian people, from Native people. So that I tell my students, you know, America is based upon two original sins: theft of land from indigenous peoples and the building of America with slave labor. Until we acknowledge that and work towards some sense of reconciliation for that, that will always be a problem for this great nation, right? So there's a natural suspicion. I've heard a lot of talk about going to the elders. There's a lot of suspicion in my community. I can speak primarily from my own experiences growing up within my community, Pokagon and Potawatomi. Natural suspicion of higher education and of institutions generally. Why? Because they've been used as tools of oppression. My great-grandmother is a survivor of the Mount Pleasant Indian boarding school. The language and the spirituality and the culture was beaten out of her. So there wasn't much passed on to my grandmother, and not much passed on to my mother, and not much passed on to me, right? So we tried to reunite our cultures as best we can. You know, we're a cat's whisker away from losing it all. But fortunately, in the last several decades, we've had a revival, a renaissance, a recollection of what we're about, who we're about, what it means to be indigenous peoples. So, but that is always a challenge, working with elders, working with young people that have, young people that have learned how to be Indian from reading books rather than talking. So it can get very confusing, but nonetheless, the efforts as described here are important, essential, substantial, significant, and I support them completely. As an example of what I'm talking about, just a few weeks ago, I'm working at a museum exhibit in Chicago, and there became a discussion about birth. We've talked about land a lot. And I mentioned the idea of Mother Earth, which was both with some Native and several non-Native people in the conversation met with. Oh, that's just New Age fantasy stuff. Or we shouldn't gender the earth. The earth doesn't have to be equal. And I thought about that. And I thought about the word that we have in Potawatomi, in our language, Nok Muskiganan, Grandmother Earth. I can't avoid what it is. We have a family relationship with the earth and all the things around us. People have spoken about, really eloquently spoken previously today, about how things have rights. Trees, stones, the land, the air, the water. They have spirit. They're living. They have rights. We have responsibilities to them. We are from reciprocal relationship societies. But too often in the last several hundred years, generally the resources, it's all been about taking, the clear cutting of the land, the draining of the wetlands, all the other things that have been done to the earth and its resources. And so we go about the business of trying to restore and revive and acknowledge our relationships and our connections to that land. There's ways of, I know that with our tribal Department of Natural Resources, with the ideas of decolonizing what they're doing, I suspect that non-native forest management people don't do this, but we engage in prayer. We engage in song. We engage in ceremony. We have conversations. We ask those grandfathers, those old trees, those old stones, that earth, what can we do for you? And we wait for the answers. Because if we have ears that we are careful, we can listen and we can hear. So we are working through the Newark Earthworks Center, and I invite everybody to check out our website. It's pretty minimal. The investment at Ohio State is pretty minimal towards American Indian faculty and initiatives, but we do the best we can. In my community, we have several environmental issues coming up. Probably the most important that we've been devastated by is the emerald ash borer that is killing all the black ash trees. We use black ash to make baskets, which is iconic material culture, iconic art, Great Lakes Indians generally, including us. What are we going to do if all the black ash trees are gone? So we heard artists say, well, we can use plastic that never biodegrades. Sarcastically, they say that. We can use vinyl blinds. We have a lot of challenges. We're trying to look at the land differently. 150 years ago, great swamps around my homelands were drained for farmland. And that land then was used and overused and abused. We are in the process of buying the land back removing those drainage ditches, returning those areas to wetlands, which restores not just the land and the spirit of that land, and not just the blood, the water of the earth. It also provides habitat for all of the creatures that need those areas. So I think this has been a really exciting program. I'm reminded I should mention that a cousin, long distance, no doubt, because she's citizen band Potawatomi from Oklahoma, but I would suggest reading Robin Kimmerer's, Kimmerrer. The name of the book is Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's a very useful book for understanding connection between Western science and traditional indigenous knowledge. And so thank you very much for having me today and for inviting me. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that's about it for me. Any questions or thoughts? Or I can turn it over to the rest of the group.
Great. Well, I think people can post into the Q&A chat some comments or in either space, and John, you can monitor that and respond to some of those questions. We are approaching time, so we are going to wrap up. Thank you, John, and thank you to Katy, Rob, Jerry, Sarah, and Kristen. It is my understanding that Jerry and perhaps others are going to stay on the program after we formally conclude at 11:30 to continue providing responses and answering questions. So please feel free to stick around a little bit after we wrap up. If we were having a physical meeting, we can naturally do this, but we are going to try to do this virtually. Very appreciate the content of this program, particularly appreciate the climate, the plan that was circulated. I had a chance to glance at that, and I look forward to looking at it in a little more detail. You know, as we think about the future, just even thinking about adapting and accepting sort of adaptation is going to be something I think we're going to be challenged to do. And I think this roadmap that you're laying out for your communities is something that we as a larger society need to start really grappling with as well. So thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate the opportunity to learn about it. As is our EPN tradition, we want to thank and recognize you with a certificate of appreciation and thanks for your participation today, albeit in electronic form. You, along with many environmental professionals who participated today, are helping us learn for life and to positively shape our world. We would normally give you a print copy of the certificate, but the virtual one will suit today. Please note that the EPN, as we look to the future, returns on the morning of Tuesday, February 9th. The EPN has been working with a team of graduates from our school: Andrew Weir, class of 1995, Mike Belantis, class of 2010, and Caleb Thomas, class of 2011, to develop a unique program that will explore how they are driving the environmental health, safety, and sustainability goals and pathway of Cardinal Health Incorporated. Cardinal Health is a company with over 50,000 employees in 46 countries and ranks among the top 25 Fortune 500 companies based in the United States. These environment, natural resource trained Buckeye alumni will discuss how Cardinal Health manufactured and distributed pandemic response equipment in 2020 while seeking to adhere to and advance their sustainability goals internally and with business partners and the federal government. We are excited that 2 student leaders of the Net Impact Ohio State undergraduate chapter will introduce our program that morning. Please visit epn.osu.edu to register for this program today. Looking ahead from there, please also save the date for the morning of March 9th. The EPN will welcome Crystal Davis, Vice President of Policy and Strategic Engagement at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, Constant Hock, Chief Administrative Officer, Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and Betsy Taylor, Founding Director and Cultural Anthropologist of the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network. This virtual event will give attention to water affordability issues in our region and explore the equity strategies that our speakers have utilized to support residents and communities where there are financial and other stressors that cause drinking and wastewater services to be unaffordable. This event will be followed by a virtual networking roundtable for students and experienced water resource professionals from federal, state, and local government, private sector consulting firms, nonprofit organizations, and academia about career pathways in water resource management. If you have further questions about either of these programs, then please reach out to Joe. We look forward to providing a formal introduction to Cecil and lead up to and during those programs. I also want to give our one more final shout out and thank you before we conclude today to Nicole Jackson. Thank you, Nicole, for what you have contributed over the years to the school and to the EPN. We are looking forward to staying in touch with and following where you go. Thanks again to our speakers and you all for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you all. And for those who want to stick around, we'll just keep the program running. Jerry, if you want to follow up on anything, and please feel free for the attendees who are in the program still to post questions in the question and answer, and we'll just keep things going for those who are able to stick around.
Can I just say one thing, Joe, before we move? So if anybody wants to connect staff, OSU people, you have my email, but if not, you can check out my LinkedIn and reach out that way if you want to stay connected. This was an awesome program to end on, by the way. I appreciate all of what the panelists brought to the conversation, and my heart is like bursting right now. So I'm so glad I'm able to, for this to be my last program and to be a part of this conversation and to just get so much knowledge and understanding of your connection to the land. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good job too. Joe, there's a question that they had jumped on the panel here that asked about the recording.
Yeah, we're going to keep recording. So this will all be part of what we will share onto YouTube. So yeah, this to Suzanne and to anyone else interested, we will just keep this recording and it will be posted later.
Cool.
Very great.
I don't know if they stuck around specifically, but I told a couple people in the answer box that they should stick around for more discussion because I wanted to hear what you guys had to say about their questions. So I don't know if folks, if they are still around, maybe folks can chat to us so we can talk about those more. But
yeah, I think since people have taken the time to write a question out, I think we should take the time to try to answer them. I think we addressed Michael in there, and the shout out. I guess I should hit answer live. I'm not really sure how this Q&A thing works, but yeah, Michael, what's up? Bizhiw, Anin, thanks for your support. I appreciate that. Miigwech. So Alex says, how can we help Indigenous communities that are being hurt by poverty while also helping the land? I've heard about many tribes that supported fossil fuel industries coming into their communities because they need the money that came with it. Is there a way that we can effectively do both? Wow. I think that question is above my pay grade. And that's a really, it's really, well, first thing, I think it's important to understand that, in Native America, there are a ton of different nations. And so it's important to recognize and acknowledge that there's a lot of different nations that are here, a lot of different languages. I think the example that I often use is like Europe, right? When people talk about Europe, there's so many different countries there. There's so many different cultures. There's different languages. There's different types of food, right? And when you talk about Native America, we need to get away from that Pan-American Indian identity and actually start recognizing the individual tribes and the nations that we are. So, to talk in general about how do we help Native America, that's a question that's too big to really address. We're battling some of the pipelines and things right now. We've been battling mining. There's this history of mining here, especially with my community in Keweenaw Bay, where we're located in what they call the copper country. After we signed the treaties of 1854, it really opened up the floodgates for land grabs and mining companies back in the day to really start exploiting everything here, because we ceded territory to the United States through those treaties. It wasn't lost to war or some of these other narratives that are out there that, well, the Indians lost the war and this other crap. Well, maybe some of the tribes did, I don't know, but our people, the Ojibwe people, we handled things diplomatically, and we signed treaties. The entire state of Michigan was actually ceded to the United States government via treaty that are still protected by the Constitution of the United States underneath the Supremacy Clause. And so our people have a lot of political clout, I guess you could say, in the things that we reserved. And we also reserved the rights to utilize the land. They're called treaty rights today, the right to hunt, fish, and gather, in those ceded lands. They're not special rights. There are things that we have always had and we retained during those negotiations. But once the mining companies got the opportunity to come up here, they went crazy. And we're still dealing with the mining legacy here. There's stamp sands right now that are threatening to cover up one of the most important spawning reefs here in Keweenaw Bay, because they crushed the rock to extract that copper and other metals out of it, and then they just dumped the sands right into the lake when they were done with them. And now those things are being moved by the lake to cover up spawning habitat for whitefish and lake trout and other native fish species that are here. And for a while, they were blaming the tribes for the decline in fish populations, because we still have some commercial fishermen that are here. Not many, but they're still here. But initially, when those populations started to decline, they initially pointed the fingers at the Indians, and the Indians are taking all the damn fish. And it come to find out that the habitat was being spoiled by the mining. It's still being spoiled by the mining efforts, from 100 years ago. And it was the tribe that brought that to the attention of the environmental agencies. So it's a really tough question, right? And we're trying to battle the pipelines that are going through our lands right now. There's a pipeline that goes underneath the Straits of Mackinac right now that there's a big political battle that's going on, and the tribes have spoken that we're not ready to gamble with those waters. Mm-hmm. And they talk about it, well, if those pipe ruptures underneath that water and the lakes are frozen, the cleanup is going to be ridiculous. And oh my gosh, the loss of revenue for tourism and all this other thing. Well, what about the loss of rights for the tribal people, right? And what about the fish and the lakes, and their rights as well that are getting violated without a say in this? So that's a very complicated question. I know some tribes have, out west, I think some of the tribes have been, getting involved with some of the tar sands, but every single tribe is unique, right? Every single one of those federally recognized tribes is like an individual nation. And so they don't speak for us and I can't speak for them.
An important point to understand or to think about from that point of view too is, why are the tribes accepting those monies in the first place? A lot of people consider it as that poverty perspective, but another role that comes along with that is having a seat at the table, so that those decisions can't just be made at that universal, oh, well, we're in charge, so we're going to make these decisions regardless. I think we've been told multiple times about decisions being made where, this pipeline is coming through, are you going to decide what's happening, or are you going to watch it happen, 10 miles off of the land here? This is all ceded territory for Anishinaabe people, for Ojibwe people. And at this point in time, of course, it's the lesser of two evils, right? Like, what do you decide? But if you're not even at the table, if you're not even having those conversations, solely boiling it down to this idea of, they need it because they need the money. Is that truly why those decisions are being made? And again, that speaks to this idea of how much time are you spending in relation to that community, to those people, with those decisions being made? How much time are you putting into that space and understanding really the nuances that come out of working in relation with, as Jerry likes to say, you know, we're one of the most police people in the States. I dare you to try and figure out how many layers and levels of governing structures that occur in a tribal community. I mean, y'all thought it was bad with your state and federal regulations, tri-state, federal, tribal, municipal.
multiple
Yeah.
Government agencies. It's crazy. And there's also a lot of misunderstanding too. I know a friend of mine over in Minnesota was saying that the pipeline that was going through, they said, look, we're either going to put this pipeline through your reservation or we're going to put it on the outside of it. And it's going through either way. But if we put it through your reservation, you know, we'll give you some money so that you can actually help monitor the situation, so that if something does happen, you guys can jump on it even faster and let us know what's going on. And from the outside looking in, it's like, oh my gosh, this tribe is letting this pipeline go through. But in reality, I mean, you're basically held at gunpoint. Like, you know, this is going through, you make this decision. Either you have a little bit of say in what happens or you don't. So it's important to really understand every single one of those situations. And it's going to be different for each one of those tribes. It's just very complex. And yeah, you know, I guess, you know, there is poverty issues and stuff like that, but it's not just tribes that are poor. You know, there's a vast majority of Americans that are poor too. So
that are also faced with these same situations and have just as little of decision making in these processes. And so part of that question might even be reevaluating for, I know a lot of folks who have been on this call, the students, this is something that we bring forward, you know, you're getting an education, you're getting education from a pretty good university. I'm from Wisconsin. Sorry, I'm a little biased. I love y'all at Ohio State, but I gotta throw it out there. But think about that understanding, like at some point in time, you're able to have this conversation. So you're sitting at someone's table. And so sometimes those bigger conversations aren't about, you know, why is the tribe answering it in this way? And why are you still investing? What can you do for divestment yourselves? If the conversation is about fossil fuels, a lot of it right now, I mean, that's you can go back and forth on where you stand on the situation, but the facts are kind of speaking for themselves at this point in time. And so really that's what a lot of the work that we've been doing and a lot of the work that's happening through this menu is to help people reframe it. Is that even the question we're asking right now? That's a really important thing to ask of yourself. What does this even mean when I bring that forward? Because so many of us we don't have enough of that background knowledge, and we haven't been taken the time or haven't been allowed the time to really access that kind of knowledge and information. And so that's on us as citizens now in this really global nation. What is it that we should be learning about? It's not just the textbooks that they're feeding us. It's not just the syllabus that they're handing over. There's got to be something beyond that. As Anishinaabe people, it's expected of us. You know, before I even walked into college, I had things that my professors called on me when I walked into my undergraduate experience. And Jerry has that same experience. And many of us as Indigenous peoples in these places, especially of higher education, you know, that's a common example. Well, what would you know about this? I mean, I was in a history class where he said, oh, we're not studying North America during prehistory because there's nothing here. My history class as a history major, that's what I was taught in my undergraduate experience. So what does that tell you? You know, you really have to reevaluate for yourself what kind of information you have access to, what you're seeking, and how do you start asking those other bigger, different questions. It's a hard one, but thank you for putting that out there for us.
Can I say?
I got to jump in real quick too on this one.
Sorry, I have to jump
I'm
off.
sorry, Nicole.
Sorry, Rob, but like the amount, I'm sorry, I'm trying not, like, this is making me so emotional because the stuff that you're talking about is just like the amount of heart work that you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Just like, I can't even explain like the layers that you were talking about, but just more so matters of the heart. Like how much work are we actually putting into it as beings, as human beings?
yeah.
Life forces to do the work. Like I'm sorry, I'm overjoyed, but I'm also like there's so much pain and like that comes with the knowledge because there's history. And I just so much appreciate all of this, even though it's, you know, very, 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 very much condensed. really,
Thank you,
I
thank you for
appreciate you
acknowledging that.
bringing
There's a
all
lot of
this.
people that don't even acknowledge that. So thank you for acknowledging it.
Mhm.
Yeah, miigwech.
Mhm.
Sorry,
And if
Ed.
you're done with your other meeting, you gotta go. Are you leaving?
Yeah, I have another one, but
We'll still be on when you're done.
Yes, I'm sure you will. I will definitely reach out to you all to continue this conversation because I have other questions. So I'm going to jump off, Joe. Thank you all. Looking forward to connecting in the future.
Come up here, Nicole.
Yeah, take care.
What are you gonna say, Rob?
So really quick last word for that last question. And it's all about US federal government policy and how they relate to domestic dependent nations, which is what every single federally recognized tribe is classified as, which means that the government talks about tribal sovereignty, but tribal people can't control their own destiny and their own economics on their own land.
Yeah, all these questions and responses are so complex. It's really difficult to address them fully. But yeah, thank you for the question. And we've been thinking about that too, like for economics, right? And you have to understand, Alex, and for those that are also interested in this response, is that as Indigenous people, literally everything has been taken from us. Literally everything has been taken from us. A prime example that I tend to use is maple syrup, right? Everyone is familiar with maple syrup and maple products and stuff like that. When you think of maple syrup, you think of Canada, or you think of Maine or Vermont, and Canada has the maple leaf on their flag and stuff. Those are all Indigenous economies. Those are all Indigenous foods that were taken from us, and we weren't even allowed to make them anymore. And so now it's a multi-million-dollar industry, and there's like very few, if any, Native people that are even participating in that. So the poverty is not necessarily self-inflicted. It's just the fact that everything has been taken, and then with the policing on top of that, Katie and I can testify to that. We're starting this Dynamite Hill Farms. We've been doing this for about a year, and the amount of I guess the word is policing, for Native people to actually do something to get like a business going where we're producing traditional foods is crazy. And so the people that even try to be self-starters and to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, which is the American mantra, like it's really, really hard for us to even do that. So you got to understand all of the impediments and the barriers that are purposefully put in place so that we do remain poor Indians and domestic dependents.
Dependent being the key word, the reliance upon these people. It's dependence or assimilation, and that is still, even though it's not okay to talk about it in that manner, it is still something that is being perpetuated by what's happening by policymakers, like Rob had said, policymakers here on this space. And so until those conversations start happening outside of just our own spaces, just our own small communities or our own tribal governments, our allies and the folks who are working with us, until that becomes a conversation that spreads and is perpetuated, which is why we do this work here. It's going to be very difficult for people to really grasp and understand how to even reframe that or think about it differently.
Yeah. And I think it's also like it wouldn't be right for me to try to answer that question, on their behalf. I don't know, the tribes that have gotten into fossil fuels and stuff like that. I think there's some tribes out west that have gotten into like coal mining and stuff too. It's not really my place to try and comment on that, because I don't even know what their situation is,
Right.
and they're probably making a decision that's best for their people,
Right.
Because they're in such dire straits. I mean, if you give those folks the chance to, actually have an equitable share and opportunity, I don't necessarily think that's the direction that they would go. But the options are often limited for Native people. So I think that's the best way that I can try to answer that question for you.
Yeah.
But we are looking, to try and get back to our traditional foods and try to take back some of these things that were stolen, but it's really, really hard. So I'll just say that, and hopefully that's enough to try and answer that question. I don't know if anyone else wanted to answer that. or try to.
Kristen's just shaking her head. That's no way.
All right, so we'll go to the
You
next
guys
one. Then.
did great. Thank you.
It says, I would be greatly appreciative of any ideas you all may have for working with young people. My organization has a youth climate action team, and we believe the perspectives of Indigenous people are critical to incorporate into this project and all of our environmental education. So for Joseph's question, I don't know who wants to jump in there. Maybe, people that are working with youth. I know, Kristen, I know you've done some work with some kids in the past too, right? And yeah, any questions or answers to that question?
Yeah, I definitely would kick this off and then maybe see what Kristen, if you wanted to add to it. So I'm a trained educator. That's been a lot of my work and goals. And I'm lucky I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with the tiniest ones. I've been in early Head Start, early education, and all the way through post-secondary, and some of our just graduated early freshmen and whatnot. And that span, the one thing that you need to truly understand is getting those students at the table, right? How do you allow for this space, that because that's the same conversation we have as being Indigenous people and not being afforded the space and the time to be a part of that conversation. How many of our young people are given that and given it seriously? So coming from as an Indigenous youth, most of the reasons why I had any opportunities was because adults had created this space, whether it be through funding opportunities so that our students could actually work. I'm seeing that a lot around here with the local natural resources department. They have a huge investment in making sure there are regular positions available for youth workers involved in the natural resources department. It is designed and specifically put in place so that those supported so that those students have access. So students have access to it in the first place. A lot of folks, I'm an educator myself, and I'm a fan of alternative education. I've worked in the Ojibwe immersion setting and a lot of experience in place-based and environmental, it's called environmental education. I don't know, we just call it Ojibwe education. And we're homeschooling our kids right now, but as what you really need to understand is we take our children out of the environment to put them in schools and create them to be industrialized workers. That's what we're doing right now. And that is across the board what we do as American citizens. And so the majority of our students, again, there isn't any access to it. Some of the strongest programs I've ever seen coming from my hometown, I know our alternative education program has been directly involved in putting students who've been outcasted or pushed to the side or aren't working in mainstream education very well. They kind of give up on these kids, and in giving up on them, our school, our local school there had, really, we have an amazing science teacher who's in charge of our alt ed program, and he has invested it in natural resources. We have the is it the forest? I don't have words all the time. The National Forest, the headquarters are over there. It's national land there on the lake shores there. Rob, someone help me, come on you guys. I'm using words I don't know. Sorry. But we have the National Park Service. Thank you. Sorry, nobody helping me.
Forestry, that's
whatever, I don't know you guys. We have the National Park Service there. We have headquarters right like a block away from the school, and so those students are directly involved. And there's a forestry program in their science classes and their high schoolers. The alt ed students, they spend their mornings in the classroom, but then the rest of their afternoons are dedicated to. They have their own sugar bush. They work with the fisheries. They're out and actually doing work within the community itself. And it counts as their education, it counts towards their credits, it counts towards their graduation. And so you have to take that on, and that it was a school district decision. And so they were able to make that at that municipal level and really apply that to the program there. And so there are so many options, there are so many places where you can start to really evaluate what does it look like for your students. We work with youth groups across in urban communities. We've been working down in Detroit where food sovereignty movements are happening, and they have specific youth leadership programs, internships. And what we've been finding is instead of trying to create new things, how could you invest in there are so many things that already exist and have likely existed there for decades, in whatever places you are. So how could you invest time and money and energy into supporting those programs and lifting those up and allowing what exists to become robust and to be seen and be brought forward? How do you bring these students to national platforms? I know I had a group of middle schoolers that I was teaching that we entered the American Indian Science and Engineering Society had a competition, a science competition, and my students placed second and third, and my school and my program supported us traveling to the program. It was to the actual conference, a national conference, and it wasn't something that middle schoolers go to, but my middle schoolers went. They went and participated in it. And so it takes a little bit of forethought, but it's really not that hard if you start thinking about it. I don't know, Kristen, if you wanted to add something to that.
I'm glad you kicked that off, Katie. I think that was all just really great. Just to kind of reiterate some of your points, one thing that was unique for me, or at least a first for me working on the tribal adaptation menu and working on some of those workshops, was just having young people around and having that be a natural part of the process. So, for those of us who are not coming from tribal communities, that might not be a super intuitive thing to think about in terms of education and how to educate youth. But I thought it was a really, great part of this process. And we always joke that now JoJo could probably lead her own climate adaptation workshop. She's been to enough of them and do enough of these conversations with us. I think I saw Rob also offered some practical ideas about some folks to get in touch with who are working on this. And I guess the only other thing I'd say is that, from my perspective, there's a lot of great expertise out there. I think, for me, coming from kind of an organization with a more federal background, we always reach out to who's the education outreach person with the National Park Service or, the Forest Service for this kind of work. And I think that there's a much wider range of people we can bring in as educators. Especially if we're able to compensate people for their time and, offer really practical things like travel expenses for more folks to participate in this. And I think there's this default to get the education person who's paid to do this and expect it to be done on a volunteer basis. But bringing other people in might mean looking for other resources.
And that's a really good point, Kristen, bringing that up. Looking at education as separate from what we're doing. I think we see youth and we see young people as separated from our jobs. They're not there yet, but how is it that these folks are going to learn these things and bring them in if you don't actually allow them to be there? And so, yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Kristen.
Yeah, and I think maybe another thing is to have those students. If you want this sort of tribal perspective or something like that, break out the TAM, break out the workbook that we created, and have those students go through that. And I think that would be a pretty good exercise to actually go through the guiding principles and have them try to understand that entire process, and then try to think about how they would incorporate the first 3 strategies in their own communities. I think maybe one of those ways to at least try to inject a little bit of the thought process that we have here with the tribal adaptation menu.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that's helpful, Joseph.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah. The next one that's on here now is Brian Snyder. Says, what overlap do you perceive between environmental practices and food systems from a Native perspective? They're one and the same as far as I'm concerned. And if you look at our treaty rights, especially ours here in the Great Lakes, it's directly tied to the ability to sustain ourselves off the land. So the rights to hunt, fish, and gather on the ceded territory is imperative, really, to our continued existence here. And then if you understand that, it's also important to understand the roles that the environment plays, right? So environmental policies and environmental degradation, that's a topic that we don't even really discuss very much, but every time there is some sort of natural disaster, or there's there's a river that catches on fire, or there's a pipeline that spills, or there's a catastrophic wildfire, or whatever the case is, all of those things are directly impacting our ability to feed our people, right? The fish that we are still eating out of Lake Superior, everyone talks about Lake Superior being this pristine body of water. It's not. There's mercury issues in those fish. There's toxaphene levels that are, that make it basically unsafe for some of those fish species to be consumed. There's toxaphene, chlordane. There's a bunch of other nasty chemicals that are out there that are getting into our fish. And so really ultimately what's happening is that our treaty rights are being diminished because we can't eat the amount of fish that we would like to. We have to be very conscious about how much fish that we're eating, the types of fish that we're eating, how we're eating those fish, whether it's skin on, or they're filleted, or whatever the case may be. Like, it's the linkage between the environment and our food systems are like inseparable. And that's something that needs to be considered. And also the fact that those treaty rights are protected by the United States Constitution, there needs to be, we need to have a much larger say in environmental policy that goes on around the water and the lands that we have rights to. And oftentimes it's some sort of like a consultation process, if anything, and they'll come in and say, oh, well, we consulted with the tribes, and then they move on. And so oftentimes, our tribes' voices are not heard in those processes, and they should be. So they're absolutely linked 100%. And here's maybe one more point too before I move on is, there's a lot of this talk about facilitated migration and as a strategy to deal with with climate change, right? And one of the things that people need to understand is that our communities, our tribes, and our reservations are permanent. We cannot pick up our reservation and move north with the migrating tree species. We can't do that. Canada won't let us do it. The United States won't let us do it. And so we are permanent in place. And that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. We can't pick our stuff up and go. Like, I can only be a Keweenaw member within the reservation and within the ceded territories. So if they start doing this facilitated migration and they're bringing up these other tree species that we don't even have a relationship with, how is that going to be impacting our food? How is that going to be impacting our culture? How is that going to be impacting our ceremony? Those are things that need to be discussed, because right now they're not. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to climate change and facilitated migration, I'm not a big fan of it. I think it's our responsibility to really fight like hell for the species that are here right now. They've been taking care of our people for thousands and thousands of years. I'm not ready to abandon them. And so the other thing that often runs through my mind is, why do we always put the onus or the responsibility on the environment to change, mm-hmm. right? Why can't we look internally and say, we know that there are, human causes that are contributing to climate change, and we're having a really hard time dealing with that. So now we're going to turn back to nature, and we're going to manipulate them so that we still get what we want out of them. Like, that perspective needs to stop.
Well, and it's a very presumptuous perspective too, to assume you know best. There was a comment on here talking about that tree documentary, the Secret Life of Trees. It's a book, yeah. And then there was a new documentary out on Amazon Prime, Intelligent Trees. And right now science is figuring out that things and ideas and understandings that have been intrinsic to tribal understandings for a millennia at this point in time, for so many thousands of years. And so one of the conversations I think Jerry brings us forward often is we impose human timelines upon understandings and ideas that go beyond. We're just this small chunk of time. And so that perception of knowledge, that perception of hierarchy, again, reframing that for yourself and understanding that you might not know these answers as professional or as
researchers.
Yeah, as important as we find ourselves to be, we might not actually know these answers. And it's quite presumptuous of us to think that we know what's going to solve these. We're all just shooting into a barrel right now, and most of us pretty blindly. So what is it that we could do to really reframe that? And I think Jerry brought that up earlier too very well. Just, we might need to slow down. That's a huge conversation. If we can't come to some sort of understanding, it doesn't mean action is always necessary. And that's a scary concept, especially for mainstream America. That's a very scary space, because that idleness has been, we've been taught to fear that in all reality. And so, yeah, that's another, I just wanted to add that on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so hopefully that's some information for you, Brian. I guess we'll just keep moving on here. This is from Emma, I'm sorry. This is a tangential question. It says, I'm a graduate student writing a dissertation looking at Fort Ancient descendants, likely Shawnee or Sioux, on the Great and Little Miami rivers. My topic is looking at what people ate based on dental data and also archaeological paleobot data. But I'm really not loving that the focus is very, here's the data, here's the plants, here's the story that I, as a white graduate student, am telling, without talking about the plants as beings, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm a bit stuck on where to go next and how to make the narrative more inclusive. I've been reading Braiding Sweetgrass and have a few ideas, and I'm going to look up guiding principles of the Sioux and Shawnee after something you said, Jerry. But wondering if you have any thoughts. Sorry for the word vomit. So I guess, answer live. Okay. So Emma, thanks for the question. It's a complex question. I don't know if I have the best answer for you, but initially what is coming to me is, you still have Shawnee people out there. You still have Sioux people that are out there. I know that you're looking at this, this real specific place, but like Katie had mentioned, we're still here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that really upset me about academia, and especially like archaeology and anthropology and stuff like that. Like we're still here.
We might have been moved,
yeah,
but we are still here. And so taking into consideration that perhaps that community, though it seems very ancient from, just the bones you're allowed to look at, those stories might still be in existence. And it's very important to reach out to the living community and the living descendants of those spaces to really gain an understanding of how you could even begin to answer those questions. And a lot of times, many of the communities, especially down south where y'all are at, those folks have been removed from that space. Was that John had mentioned, he's 400 miles away from where all of you are at, and he's the closest. Their community is one of the closest federally recognized communities, also very intentional. So going back and doing your historical dives, look into the treaties and figure out where communities had been removed to, and taking the time to follow that line, and start to seek out some of the communities that have their history still exist. And so starting in that space and recognizing that it's not just the dental records. There are still people there.
There's still hearts beating right now.
Yeah, good damn.
And I would also caution you too, and this is the issue that oftentimes that I have with academia, is that you're operating under a timeline, right? Like you have to graduate by X date. And to really do the work that's necessary to establish those relationships with the Shawnee Nation or the Sioux Nation is gonna take time, and it's gonna take effort on your part. And I think the guiding principles that we've put together for the Tribal Adaptation Menu will be a good place to start. Like how do I approach these people in a good way, and how do I just stop being a taker again? And I say that because, over time, our communities have really developed a distrust with academia, because time after time after time, we've had researchers come into our communities, sit down with us, take whatever they want or whatever they need, and then they're gone. and nothing ever returns back to the community. There's no like reciprocity built into there. So a lot of our people are like, well, screw this. Here's just another academic coming in to, you know, pad their CV, and you know, they're just going to use us again. So really taking the time and the guiding principles there, I think would be a really good place to start. And then you really need to work on establishing meaningful relationships. And when I say that, it's not necessarily, you know, just go up there and shake their hands and be cordial, but, you know, maybe you have to go over and spend some time with those people and help them wash their dishes and, you know, help them clean up their yard or whatever the case may be. But like you create a real friendship that I would imagine is going to persist even after your project is published. And that's the thing that needs to be happening more often, because then you will understand things more, not necessarily from the academic perspective, but from the real perspective and from the people that you're actually trying to look at. So I know that's a really tough ask on my part, but
it's the realist one.
Yeah,
it's necessary.
It really is. So establishing those relationships are really important, and even telling your professors and the faculty, or, you know, whoever's on your what do you call it, your board or your committees, yeah, like say, I don't think that this is actually the best way to approach this. You know, this is what you guys have been doing for so long, but I think we need to do something a little bit different, and start pushing back and say, this is what I feel is right. You know, I heard some tribal people talk about this, and this is what they're saying is the best way forward, not necessarily what Ohio State thinks, but what do the people that you're dealing with think? And that's kind of the best way I can answer that, I think, for now. Anything else you want to add to that? Okay, cool. Yeah, miigwech, and best of luck to you, Emma. Oh, there you are. Yeah, you're still on, Emma. Cool. Okay, well, I'm going to keep moving on here, but Richard Bradley says, at Jerry, can you address the beings that we classify as invasive or introduced? Many of these beings supplant or damage the native beings of our region. Is this concept invasive species an appropriate one? Man, you're hitting on a topic that I think we talked about and we tossed around for a really long time with that TAM team. And we actually have, if you look at the TAM itself, like we address that a little bit in there, but it's trying to get away from this whole knee-jerk reaction, right, of, oh, you know, this is an invasive species, this is, you know, a non-native species, and you know, we need to do something about it. Oh, it's invasive, we need to eradicate it. And what we need to remember is that each one of those species, they're living by their original instructions. That's another like old way of understanding things, is that we're all given these original instructions of how to live in place in a good way. And that's everyone. It's not just Ojibwe, it's not just the Shawnee, but it's also the European tribes and stuff that were over there too. We've all had those original instructions. It's the same thing that those invasive species have too. They're just carrying out what they're supposed to be doing. But it's our problem. It's our issue of thinking that we know what's best, and we move these things around. And, you know, we're on this global scale now where things are, you know, shooting all over the earth now, and these things are landing in places that maybe they shouldn't be, or maybe they should, you know, I don't know. And I don't know if you can recall the term for what we used in that TAM meeting, but she can speak about that from an Ojibwe perspective.
I don't remember the precise term. We actually went to one of our cultural leaders, an elder, to ask about, you know, what kind of term would we use, and Bakan Debane Dog was a jig, something to that extent, but it's this idea of it's instead of calling them an invasive species, it's more of seeing someone who has come from a place of a different origination, reframing it for ourselves, and because they're not necessarily invaders, they didn't even bring themselves here. Like Jerry had said, they kind of were supplanted in this space, and part of why they are, how we would understand it, or how we would kind of reflect on it, is, are they invasive species versus are they beings we just don't understand yet? You know, I remember back when the Asian carp conversation of them traveling up north and getting into the Great Lakes, you know, it was a very simple conversation. Folks would just said, well, if we just ate carp, then we would be fine. If we would just allow people to go fish, you know, it promoted carp eating, and they would be able to be balanced out. And so reframing that conversation for ourselves, it's out, folks that say, oh no, I wouldn't eat fish like that. Well, it's just because you haven't before. And so
and having an understanding too that each one of those beings, they also have gifts.
And medicines or teachings, understandings.
We had talked about it.
We don't know it yet, though.
We had talked about even like the cross-cultural sharing of information, so that those beings, those fish or those plants or whatever it may be, are indigenous to some place, and there are people that have relationships with those beings as well. And why are we not reaching out to them and talking to them, right? And one of the things that we have here in Lake Superior now is the Atlantic sea lamprey. And that has also had a really detrimental effect on our native fish populations. And one of the things that they had suggested was that like people eat sea lamprey. And we actually looked into it, but we found out that they're just riddled with mercury. And so it's the environmental pollution too, that's also impacting some of those, responses to those new beings being here. So there's a lot to that. I would just, tell people to pause. Number one, we should, again, like we're looking at these plants and, what do we do about these plants or these other beings, and how do we correct them? When in reality, why aren't we looking at ourselves and saying, well, how do we stop the transmission of these things coming to these places where maybe they shouldn't be? What is it? The aphids and stuff like Animal Plant and Health, and they're supposed to be having checkpoints and stuff like that. We're still promoting like the propagation of non-native ornamentals and stuff like that in our gardens because they look pretty, and then birds eat the seeds and they go poop out in the woods, and all of a sudden you have this established population somewhere. Like why are we continuing to do that? Why are we allowed to sell those plants in areas where they're not native to, and we don't even understand the ecological ramifications of that introduction? So we just need to be a little bit more careful, a little bit more aware, and not just say, oh, well, they look pretty, or whatever the case may be. With garlic mustard, I think one of the things that I proposed that never actually got any traction was that we import a bunch of Italians to actually go harvest the garlic mustard from the woods and just make a bunch of pasta with it, or whatever the case may be. That's a joke, obviously, but how can we utilize some of those plants, if we can eat them, as opposed to spraying herbicides and stuff like that on there. That's kind of where my thought process is anyways on invasive species. So
and just a reiteration and a reminder, it's been said a couple of times before, but we're looking at climate change and climate crisis, and for most people that calls for this, it calls and requires an immediacy in the response, right? We've got to do something about it, and sometimes we might not know what it is to be, and so to really answer those spaces, and it's very hard to slow that down. And so over and over and over again, I know that's something that we're taught culturally and from an understanding. Slow down, step back, take a minute and really understand, take a moment to understand you don't know anything about this at this point in time. That's something I just want to keep pushing again and again.
So we'll keep trying to truck along here. Thank you, Richard. So there's a question from Paul Denton. It says, it is rare to hear of issues of concern to Native and First people discussed with an Ohio perspective. How might one become more informed and best provide support? Oh man. I would say that the education system itself is really doing a disservice in this country, and that's across the board. There's some things like over in Wisconsin where there's a Act 31 where it was essentially mandated by the Wisconsin legislature that the schools actually start teaching about the histories of Wisconsin, about the tribes, and it has to be taught in schools. And the other cool thing about that is that they actually commission the tribes themselves to develop the content and the curriculum so that it's actually coming from the people and not necessarily from an anthropologist or something like that.
And it's a full committee that works through the DPI with ongoing support and structures. It's ongoing, it's regularly funded. It's something that isn't just, oh, we're going to teach about this past history space of it. There are ongoing contributions. It's a very it's very much a living exercise for that space. One thing needs to be taken into consideration is the fact that Ohio itself was battlegrounds for the removal of an Indigenous population. So understanding that it's very intentional that there aren't perspectives from Ohio, that needs to be first and foremost understood. And again, almost similar to that same response with Emma, there are tribes who have been removed from those spaces who still exist. I know John was on earlier, and he's a member of the Potawatomi tribe, and so many of their people were moved down to Oklahoma. And so how many, those stories still exist. It wasn't really that long ago that a lot of those grandparents were telling the stories that their grandparents told them. And so that they do exist. But again, what Jerry had pointed out in that earlier response is it takes time and it takes relationship building. And so what kind of Nicole pointed out as we were having this conversation, that idea of this being heart work. This is not hard work, it's heart work. And so it's work that has to be very intentional. And it's not going to be in your 9 to 5. You're not going to find it in your lecture halls. And Jerry kind of spoke to that when he touched on the idea of American education and the disservice we're brought in. You know, we aren't taught the truths behind what happened in those spaces, and Ohio is celebrated as a space of conquer and a space of success and
successful genocide
and
removal, yeah.
It was, if you flip the script on that, if you turn it around and look at it from the other perspective, there was so much loss that occurred and just over that mountain range, just that there was so much that happened just in that space. And so at this point in time, we aren't going to be able to do anything but learn on it on our own, take the time, really be invested in learning that. But in doing that, you could start bringing those conversations forward. And that's the most important part of it.
And the other thing too is that this stuff wasn't necessarily hidden.
No.
So the United States actually has like written record of basically everything that has happened.
Right.
I mean, in the Library of Congress, or wherever those records are kept, like they had communications about what was going on and why they're doing it and how they're going to do it.
Very likely right in the archives, right in Ohio State. John made the point of calling land grant versus land grab. They were intentionally, though, the universities house a significant amount of that information, as do the local the parishes, historical societies usually, yep, and a lot of them are tied together. And then actually church, heritage and church communities. So like the Catholic Church itself holds, so the Jesuit communities have so much of this information. And
also take that with a grain of salt, though, because they're the ones that wrote it.
Yes, and it has to be read with those historical glasses on and really looking at it from that lens and perspective. However, it's not hidden information. It's not shared information, but it's not hidden. And you can take the time to really start to find out what was going on in these spaces.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aliyah, for all of your. She's adding in all these links and stuff.
Right on.
Thank you,
I
Aliyah.
appreciate that. So how does one become more informed and best provide support? You just gotta do the legwork yourself, really. It's there. You just gotta start digging, and then start sharing too, and letting other people know this. And the other thing too is, don't necessarily take the narrative from the Native people either. It's important that we also have, our people are the ones that are sharing, a lot of that history. So that we're not shoved to the back or the side again.
And what Jerry emphasizes on that is don't take the narrative, participate in that narrative and learn about your own roles in it and what happened because of it. And empower and bring that up if you could. Again, this is something that's often, we're in a position, we're speaking in a place where we're talking to peoples of privilege. Bottom line is, if you were on this call, you are in some sort of space of privilege, and so you have some sort of ability to bring voices forward. So how could you yourself refrain from being the person to go doing some of this? How could you bring other people who are already doing this? That's another way to reframe that for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. The next one is more of a comment, I think, from Jessica. That says, "Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and insight on all of this."
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, miigwech for listening, Jessica, and for hanging in there. For those that are still there, we appreciate that. and we appreciate the opportunity to share as well. So thank you all. The next one is from Jeremy Block. It says that at Jerry, as someone who has practiced restoration ecology for a decade, has had formal education, has worked with many different people, and have always believed in Indigenous culture and ways of life, how do you as a natural resources forestry person suggest one tries to engage future companies, customers, and government agencies to buy in to the TAM movement? Yeah, that's a really hard one, man. Because a lot of those companies, the customers, I mean, they're tied in with the capitalistic game, and you know, a lot of them, especially the large landholders, you know, they're either TMOs or REITs, and they have investors that need returns on the actions that they're doing, and so they're really focused on the return, right, on the management that they're doing. When in actuality, you know, we need to sort of focus on what you're doing with restoration, and how do we give back? You know, how do we slow down the take, and how do we give back? And I don't know if that really can coexist right now. I mean, maybe I should take some more time to think about that and how that would work. But as of right now, I don't really have a good answer for you on how to, you know, make those capitalistic systems slow down and see another way. Like as it stands right now, I don't really have a good answer for you. But I think the story that always resonates with me is, you know, if you're serious about sustainability, not sustainability to your business model necessarily, but the sustainability of life, it's important that you actually start looking at what the tribes are doing. You know, we've successfully had a society and a life and a vibrant culture for thousands and thousands and thousands of years in this space, and it didn't just happen by accident. You know, there's ways that you comport yourself, and there's the reciprocal way of being that ensures that there's going to be sustainability for the future, not necessarily your bottom line, you know, or your portfolio, but for life itself. And if people can't really see that and the importance of that, then, you know, I'm not really sure that you're going to be able to convince them. You know, I have a lot of hope in our younger generations, but I'm also like not a fan of kicking the can down the generational line. You know, I think, you know, Jeremy, hopefully, you know, you can use your education and you can use your background to just basically try to convince these people, you know, we need to use less. We need to slow down, and we need to stop doing land conversions, and we need to stop creating these monocultures by these massive companies. That's happening here. You know, we have some of the most amazing sugar maple stands in the world here in the Western UP, and some of these forestry companies are coming in here and they're clearing it, completely clear cutting everything, and they're installing these conifer monocultures, and they become biological deserts, you know, in areas that my people used to sugar, and they used to make that maple sugar. And now it's gone, you know, and there's hardly any beings, or after they herbicide it and they use pesticides and then they plant. You know, there's a story too where they clear cut one of these areas, and we have raspberries like the most the dominant seed in the seed banks around here. And so when you clear an area, typically raspberry comes back really quick. And so there was a big clearing, and we had a lot of our tribal members that went out there and they were picking raspberries. And they had a crop duster that came over that was spraying herbicides on, and actually they sprayed some of our tribal people that were out there trying to pick some of those berries. And so how do you tell those people that, you know, leave the herbicides at home, and we need to start working with the land instead of just trying to dominate it. It's really hard, man. And I guess, you know, on small levels, you might be able to actually, you know, from doing that hard work, you might be able to you know, touch somebody individually, but it's the systems that are created, these mechanical systems that don't have a heart, that you're not really going to be able to get to. And I would just say, I wouldn't say like to stop trying. I mean, continue to try, absolutely 100%. Get the tribes involved if possible, elevate their voice and their way of life, and their rights even. But it's really hard to stop a monster that doesn't have a heart, you know.
Being another voice that says something, though, a lot of people don't give themselves enough credit for that. And a lot of folks who find themselves in these situations, whether on these committees or they're in these working groups or they're being sought after for advice. We've seen it recently and time again, people who just don't say anything because it's not considered, you know, it's a little faux pas, or it's not considered professional, or, you know, it's a little too wishy-washy. And there's something to be said about standing up and saying it. And it's one thing coming from a couple of Native folks who are living on the land and working for our people. We'll have this conversation over and over again, and we'll continue to have that talk. But part of that is that word that I brought forward at the beginning when we talk about that Ziigwanikwe, and the idea of being strong of heart and saying something. I mean, we're teaching our kids, see something, say something, right? These people continue to get away with these things because people don't stand up and say something about it and say it's not right, it's wrong. And there, you would be surprised at how many other folks sitting around those tables and are thinking them in their minds and are just waiting for someone else to say it. And the loudest voice is heard. And a lot of people say that, you know, money talks, and there's a reason why those are all, that's how we understand things, because people have to stand up and say those things. And so if it's not just, you know, the hippie culture or the co-ops and, you know, the folks in the background saying these things, if it becomes a conversation, whether it's in your classrooms, whether it's on your syllabi, whether it's with your own, within your own, as a student, if you're bringing it up and challenging and pushing that, the more people who carry that and shoulder those burdens, the less of us are weighed down by it, and the more that comes forward. There will come a tipping point. There has to come a tipping point for these conversations to be forward. And so you have to still have faith in that space of saying, you know, it's regardless of how this is, it's not right, and we have to say something. And so use those spaces to the best of your abilities and keep walking forward, and know, you know, don't be disheartened either. It's hard in this time, in this day and space.
Definitely ain't it ain't easy work, that's for sure. I can attest to that, but it's important work. So yeah, that's another one that, you know, that's a really complicated question there, but it's an important one. So thank you for asking. Going to the next one, there's a couple of comments, I guess, from Richard. It says, I haven't had time to read the TAM, but I certainly will do that. This is exactly what I'm thinking. They, the invasive species, have their own histories and needs, but I feel so bad for the local species being replaced. You know, Richard, we can speak firsthand what it's like to be replaced in the land. And in some ways, you know, you could almost think of like the, you know, colonization of being this introduction of a non-native being, you know, to this space here. And you can really see what happens when it really goes unchecked, I guess, or when there's not some mutual understanding between the species that are around there. You know, we've been displaced, really. You know, we've lost so much of our footprint or our natural range, if you will. But we're still here, you know, and eventually you get to a point, you know, where those non-native species become naturalized, right? And I kind of think that that's what's going on now as far as colonization is concerned. And you know, maybe it's time for the non-local beings to you know, start listening to the local beings and how to actually live in this space in a good way. And it's the same thing. I mean, what I said about the plants is the same thing that goes for people and human beings as well. You know, we're all given those original instructions, and even over in Europe, right? Like there, you know, we all come from tribes. Everybody comes from tribes at some point down the line. And each one of those tribes had these original instructions and ways of living in place in a good way, with sustainability in mind. And I know that to be true because you're still here, right? If your ancestors didn't live a sustainable way of life, then you would cease to exist. And so all of us have those teachings in us at some point down the line. But it's whether or not we want to try to hear those teachings or understand those teachings. I think that's one of the conversations that Katie and I have often is, you know, it's not just Ojibwe people that have these understandings. It's literally everybody. You know, over in Europe too, all those tribes were broken up and colonized as well, and taken over and subjugated, that were living in a good way. And I don't know enough about those cultures to really say, but the only thing I ever hear that comes up is what heathens and pagans and some of these other terms that were also used to describe us. But those ways of living were basically taken away, right? And so it's important that we find those original instructions again, all of us, you know, not just the native people, but our European relatives that are here now as well. Like, what are your original instructions? What are your original teachings to live in a place in a good way? In a way, you know, we're kind of, we're maybe a little bit more privileged in that, because, you know, we're still in our homelands and our home territories, and we're still with our relatives here, and that we still have stories of this place. But the Europeans, man, you know, you guys are really far away from home, and a lot of those stories were taken from you long before they were taken from us. And so it's a really interesting sort of discussion when you start thinking about those things, and maybe that can actually help answer the last question as well. You know, as those corporations, you know, like, you know, they're not people, you know, but the people all have their own stories, but they're not actually being brought forward.
And part of what a lot of the things that we try to remind people when we have these conversations, and I like the way Jerry kind of phrases it sometimes. He said, you know, if you looked at Ojibwe people, Anishinaabe, or Indigenous peoples as like the indicator species, you would understand a bit better of how to be, how to live, how to exist. And learning about that Indigenous perspective isn't so that you can take from that or become that yourself. It's just another way or a way to help you see that you can look that from within and see that within yourself as well. We're just at this point in time, we're some of the strongest reminders in place that teach people to remind people that you are a person, you do exist on this place. We, like Jerry said, we have the stories, we have the ceremonies, we have the drums, the songs, the understandings that tell us. We get to, I don't have a void in myself. I don't have to seek outside of where I am, because I have those gifts still in place. But by seeing who we are, and by seeing what kind of people we are, and by seeing that it's possible, it's that one step that maybe can help you look, as you're looking back on what journey you traveled with your peoples and your cultures, and looking forward on what steps you can make, that it is something that exists. It's not a mythology. It doesn't exist in just the books. It's not a legend. It's right here. It's right now. So how can you take that up and use that bravery and that humility to grasp that with yourselves?
Yeah, and I would even say that maybe sometimes people are using science as that to fill that void. And I know, and I appreciate science, and, you know, I've done some science myself too, but I've also understood that, you know, science really takes out a lot of the other aspects of being human, and it becomes very mechanical. And so you're not really going to get all the answers from just using that method of knowing. But not to dissuade you from pursuing that academic career in science and stuff like that, but just to keep your mind open that there are other ways of understanding and seeing things. And I know you all feel them too, because you're a human, and maybe start paying a little bit more attention to those things. I would encourage you to. So I think that's about that. There's another comment from Richard that just says thank you, and you know, thank you as well for thank you, Richard, for being with us and spending some time with us too. You know, we really appreciate your time too. So miigwech. And there was one more thing up there that is that Elia had mentioned something as it was a language question. I don't know if Katie wants to answer that really quick.
Yeah.
And then I think that'll be it.
That one's pretty, actually that's pretty simple. That the win on the back of Ojibwe just creates a noun. Zungade is the verb, zungade win is the noun. So it's a nominalizer. And the only thing I'd really want to kind of bring that forward is to kind of help you, there's the part of that is why sometimes it's not pronounced, is because we don't speak in nouns the same way that Americans use nouns. Most of our nouns exist because we have a verb-based language. So our language, the way we speak, is action-based. And so most of the way you hear natural Ojibwe spoken will be in that action base, and not often will you hear so many of those nouns. And so people use those nouns when they're talking about a certain specific thing, those lists, but that's actually much more common nowadays than it would have been in speaking. And so that itself is a really fun conversation, very long and extended because there's a lot to it, but it speaks a lot to what the English language itself, which is a very noun-based language, what is lacking in that space. When you rely on talking about things, you aren't able to speak on action, and you aren't able to understand the fluidity and the motion of things, of existence in all reality. And so it is a really interesting concept, that idea of language and what language does to reframe for ourselves and how we understand things. And most of the understandings that I've been really blessed with have come from the fact that I've had experience, some just little bits of experience with language, and really seeing words that describe things that my heart understands that I never knew I actually could verbalize and bring forward. So it's kind of a cool way to end it. Thank you, Elia.
Yeah, I think that's it. What do you think there, Joe?
We got Joe sucked in the last time we talked with him too, so.
There's a way in which you, both of you, thank you so deeply. And when you both speak, Katie, it echoes what you just said, that there are sometimes when there are words that come to the heart rather than maybe necessarily, I could never think or be able to put the words together in English or in any other language. And you speak, both of you have spoken, and your team members as well too, and Dr. Lau, in ways that I think resonate in here. And I know there's 16 others who are on this call listening, who are also feeling that too. And
soldiers.
Yeah, so I'm so glad we have the ability to record your remarks and to share them back. So everyone who's still with us on the call, you'll have a chance to revisit this again later. I've also been able to save the chat and the Q&A. So if there are some things maybe you weren't seeing on the back end for those who are attending, that'll all be shared back later. Yeah, Aaliyah, I think you're summing it up for us. Thank you so much. And to the both of you, thank you for being so generous with all the time before today and today. You can't say enough. So please, we'll be in touch for sure. And I imagine be careful putting your email out there, because I imagine you get lots of people following up. So thank you for making yourselves available as the other panelists did too.
Yeah, the next time when this pandemic is done, you should bring us down for a couple days, and we'll kick it in all kinds of classes and kick it with faculty and students. And that's what we really appreciate, is that time to actually, because you get different vibes, when you're in person. And sometimes those are longer lasting than a webinar. So
right.
Yeah,
we'll be back to those days, and we would love to have you here and help us learn for our lake, Lake Erie, and our river, Ohio River, and Scioto, and all the wonderful things that we have here in our area. So thank you.
Yeah, great job. Have a good rest of your day, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bumpy.
Great job.
Miigwech. Thank you, everybody, too.
Thanks, everyone, for hanging on.
Okay.
Bye. See ya.
Bye.